Welcome to today's CHDH seminar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Astrid Zeman, who's a research fellow in data science, but I think is just as much a cognitive scientist as she is a data scientist. She has a background in areas including machine learning and robotics, and was working on deep learning before that was fashionable, I think, and she's applied big methods to problems across a range of areas in visual perception and cognitive neuroscience. She did a PhD at Macquarie, I think, on computational modeling of visual illusions, and then had positions here at the University of Melbourne and at KU Leuven, and we're glad that she's back here now at the University of Melbourne. So welcome, Astrid. The talk today is about how context and shape influence vision in humans and machines.
Thanks, Charles. So today's talk is all about objects and scenes, and the shape versus category of objects. And Charles, Charles already mentioned the acknowledgement of country. So I also acknowledge Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nation, who are traditional custodians of the land on which University of Melbourne stands. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Okay. So as I mentioned, I'm talking about objects in scenes, and object shape versus category information. And so I've structured the talk into two parts, and each part is covered by a separate paper. The first part is a paper that just came out in PloS Computational Biology, which is very exciting because it's been a long time coming. I think we started it back in 2019, and so for it finally to get published is gives you an idea of how long it takes to be able to finally publish neural data in journal articles. Okay. So this is the first half of the talk that I'll be presenting. And the main author of this paper is Associate Professor Stefania Bracci, who's located at CIMEC in Italy at the University of Trento. And it was also conducted in the lab of Professor Hans Optebeck at KU Leuven, with research assistants Jakob Mraz and Gail Lees, who helped with the data collection and analysis. Okay. Objects and scenes co-occur in our visual experience, as you can see in these examples. And we know that this can facilitate object recognition when an object is placed on a congruent background. There is also neural evidence for this congruency when it comes to the location of an object in a scene. This suggests that there might be an interaction between objects and scenes within our visual hierarchy. We also know that when it comes to objects and scenes, that they activate pretty much separate networks within the ventral stream. This shows a map here for scenes versus faces, but a similar map can be shown for scenes versus objects versus animals, and so on. And here we want to test how these contextual regularities are represented throughout our visual hierarchy at the neural level. And we would also like to see whether deep convolutional neural networks, or DCNNs, I might also call them deep neural networks or CNNs. So these deep neural networks are considered to be the state of the art in terms of visual object recognition. And we'd like to know whether these networks can replicate the same representational spaces and show similar representational hierarchy. Okay. So to do so, we created this design where we have two conditions, animals versus animals and the background. And I'll go here. And as you can see, there is contextual association where there is a gorilla placed together with a specific background of the jungle, in this case, and we created 6 pairs and made sure that the low-level visual properties could not account for some effects, such as making sure that the body shape of the animal is controlled. For example, we have a gorilla that is matched with polar bear, and they are similar in shape, that they have similar facial features, they have limbs. From at the semantic level, they're both considered to be mammals, but of course they are associated with different backgrounds. And the same is true for the 2 birds and the 2 small animals with bright colors. And so we used these images in an event-related design where participants were asked to judge similarities both in semantic and contextual association. And here I show results from a number of ROIs from early visual cortex, which is that BA17, which usually does just really low-level visual information, through to prefrontal cortical regions, frontal parietal areas, focusing on scene selective and animal selective areas in VTC. Okay. We also included a number of deep neural networks, and those that are trained in object recognition, and they differ in terms of the number of layers. We use a technique called representational similarity analysis, which I think some people may have heard of before, to test both brain data and deep neural networks and data against a number of models. Okay, so we can feed images through fMRI data or through the network and build these dissimilarity matrices, which are shown in this column, and use that to find out how the inside of the brain data or inside of the network, how similar or distant are 2 objects or scenes from one another. Okay, and we can compare these dissimilarity matrices with a number of different models. So we have this domain-specific model, and this predicts separation between animals and scenes. Okay. We have also a co-occurrence model, which predicts the integration between each animal and its specific scene. And in addition, we have 2 control models for visual properties, which include the GIST model, which also does low-level visual properties, and the condition model, which predicts within condition similarity. Okay. So how are contextual regularities represented at the neural level? When it comes to early visual cortex, we found a small but significant effect for the GIST model. In VTC animal selective areas, we found a strong effect for the domain-specific model, which was also found in scene selective areas. So within VTC, the major dimension that seems to explain this representation is rather the separation between these 2 domains, which is indicated by the blue bar. However, in frontal parietal areas on the far right, we found some evidence for representational similarities associated between animals and their specific scenes, which is denoted by the purple color. The effect here is relatively small, and so but because the noise ceiling is low, this suggests this is quite a significant effect. And then we observe the integration at the level of frontal parietal areas. Okay. So let's see whether deep neural networks are able to emulate this representational hierarchy. So when it comes to here, I'm going to show you AlexNet. In the first stages of processing, we see an effect for GIST in yellow, followed by an effect for the domain-specific model And this is in line with previous findings, which I'll talk about in the second half of my talk, on category effects around this stage of processing for DNNs. But what is interesting here is the effect for the co-occurrence model, which emerges at the later stage and stays up till the end. And if you focus your attention on the upper part of the matrix, of the dissimilarity matrix, you'll see this second diagonal emerging, and that reflects the direct association between each animal and its scene. Okay. And this slide is a bit cluttered, but this is just to show that the effect was shown for all networks that were tested, with the transition from yellow to blue to purple in a similar way. So the networks first represent low-level visual properties, then category, and then the contextual information with an animal and its scene. So this result showed that DNNs capture this representational hierarchy that we see in the brain. And even when we look at behavioral data, this suggests that they really seem to learn somehow the conceptual idea that we have about the world, such as that polar bears live in ice landscapes and so on. So here you can see the fish with the sea anemone, ladybugs and leaves. So they're clustered closely together. And indeed the correlation here is especially high in the last fully connected layer. However, this could also be explained by other trivial effects that are in the training set, because this effect is really quite unexpected. And one possibility could be that the networks are trained on images where there is a polar bear labeled polar bear, but there's also information about context in the images. So it might be that the networks are relying, say, on the scene information in order to classify the image as a polar bear. And indeed, when we tested this, it seems to be the case. So here we trained AlexNet with different data sets that had, say, for example, either a 0% congruency between whether that the polar bear was always placed on a random background, up to 100% congruency where the polar bear was always placed on a congruent background. And here you can see that indeed congruency in the data set facilitates object recognition, which is also confirmed with RSA in the models. Okay. So from left to right, you see 0% congruency up to 100%. And with 0% congruency, you see no effect of co-occurrence in the network shown by the purple line. And as you increase congruency in the stimulus set, co-occurrence increases. So it seems that we do find some similarities between DNNs and the brain fMRI data, from object scene separation to integration. However, DNNs learn these representational spaces. The way they learn them is completely different to the way that we learn them. Yes. I'm not sure whether to speak to other things about that, but usually the networks are trained purely for object discrimination and object recognition. And that's the main goal, versus when it comes to humans, we really are looking, we have much more behaviourally rich representations. So the second aim from this paper was to look at within domain representations, because we know that VTC, ventral temporal cortex, which is the area of the seat of object recognition, it contains very behaviourally rich representations. For instance, animacy areas do not respond equally to all animals. And you have this on the left, what's known as an animacy continuum. So some animals are grouped together more closely than others. And there's also evidence on the right, you can see for scene spaces that are well characterized by the degree of navigational content. And this is just a couple of examples, but there are more examples of this very rich behaviourally relevant spaces in VTC. And however, I just mentioned that DNNs are only trained to recognize differences, say, between faces or objects or scenes. So can they capture this rich behaviorally relevant space? So our design allowed us to not just look at across domain representations and associations, but also within domain spaces. For example, with the in-domain animal condition, we have animacy continuum from mammals to bugs. And within the scene condition, we have 50% of the images characterized by navigational content, whereas the remaining images have low information content in that regard. All right, so we have more matrices that we can compare against in our brain data versus our models. Okay. And so the question is, do deep neural networks show similar domain specialization? So we can analyze the fMRI data to look at animal and scene selective areas. And within GoogleNet, our DNN, we can have a look at whether we've trained it for objects or if we've trained it for scenes. Do they also have similar representational spaces? Right. So this is the brain data. Yeah, and here we see a nice double dissociation where animal selective areas were well characterized by the animacy model. And it was the opposite for the scene selective areas. And this confirms this rich representational space that we see in VTC. And when it comes to DNNs, do they have these representational spaces? And for the top figure on the top right, we see that when it comes to animacy continuum, it does represent this, that especially at the later stage of processing. However, this effect was not observed for the scene trained model, and the gray area highlights where there was no effect for the navigational model. So this shows that the networks are limited in capturing the full complexity of VTC representational spaces in terms of behaviorally relevant dimensions. And so to summarize, I guess, the key points from this paper, we show that DCNNs capture the brain's representational hierarchy for objects and scenes, but this can be explained by the training in that object images are usually shown on congruent backgrounds. And that these DNNs do not fully capture behaviorally relevant within domain VTC representational spaces. And this is important because it shows that the way that VTC is represented reflects the way that we interact with the environment, as opposed to just doing visual processing, and that's all about visual discrimination. So whether I'm looking at a face or a scene or an object, context really matters. It's not just about discrimination. And object recognition is just the first stage of processing within BTC and not the ultimate goal. Okay. So this is the full paper. You just got a whirlwind tour of brain data, DNNs, representational matrices, and take-home messages. So if you want to read more about it, it's just come out. Yeah, I think a fortnight ago now. All right. And now we're on to part 2 of my talk, which is all about object shape versus category. And this was a study that was done prior to this one, obviously. And here we were looking at object shape versus category in deep neural networks compared to human visual cortex. I'm wondering should I do questions at the end, or do people want to ask questions now for this first study? I don't know what's better for, how is this normally done? Okay, all right. And I have another 15 or so minutes to go through this one. Okay. Because I can expand or contract depending on how much time I have. Yes, so some of you may have seen this, me talk about this paper before, which is all about how shape and category significantly correlate in natural images. So bodies are elongated, faces are round. And so we had this question about whether CNNs represent, well, how do they represent object shape and category? And does this correlate with human visual representations? And in this study, we had 2 data sets, which is quite rare for a lot of fMRI studies. And the way that they represented categories and shape, well, I should say shape information was distinct in that this first data set looks at a more high level definition of shape, which is high versus low aspect ratio. So whether things are elongated versus round. And we have 2 categories, animal versus non-animal. And in the second data set, we had many more. We had 6 categories and 9 different shapes. And I guess one of the main differences to note is, say, the final 3 columns, which show that the orientation of elongated shapes is represented in distinct ways. All right. I think this goes back to, I guess, explaining a bit more in detail about what RSA is, or even the behavioural task, where we can group objects. Say if we ask a participant to group them by shape, people will drag and drop them together, and this will happen for all elongated objects. However, if we ask them to group by category, then they will drag, say, the remote apart away from the bugs, and you get these different representational spaces, and we can use the distance to form a matrix and use that to quantify distances within and between categories. Okay. So we can then derive these models, we call them behavioral models, that allow us to, based on this drag and drop technique, which is really officially called multiple object arrangement, we can then create these behavioral matrices for shape versus category. And we can do this for both data sets. And so I guess I mentioned how the orientation matters of these final 3 columns. And this you can see reflected in the shape matrix on the bottom right-hand corner, where you can see, even though these elongated objects are all grouped together, you can also see that the orientation effects of, they're separately grouped as well within elongated objects. Does everyone see that? The small squares. These small squares. This reflects like the elongated objects, this bottom right-hand corner, and each of these show fragmentation effects. All right. And given this technique, representational similarity analysis, we can compare the models with deep neural networks and with fMRI data. And here we used V1, I think VA17, same area, as well as anterior and posterior ventral temporal cortex. We analyzed 4 networks which have different lengths, different number of layers. And so here is a lot of data. So dataset A is the top row, dataset B is the bottom row. And the shape information is shown by the orangey red color, and the category information is shown in blue. And from left to right, you have networks that have less number of layers, like starting with AlexNet or CafeNet with 8 layers, through to ResNet 50, which has 50 layers. And the main, you can see that shape information is quite high for most layers until the very end where it drops, which is more evident in dataset B than A. And the category information goes above the level of significance, which is the dotted line, in the later stages of processing for all networks. Okay. And if we look at brain data, you also see this interaction effect. So shape information is high and significant at early visual areas, but then goes down, whereas category information goes the other way. In V1 early visual area, it's below significance, and then in anterior VTC, it becomes relevant. All right. And so if we, apologize about that axis. So if we look at the same data set A and B, we can look at these 3 different areas. So blue is V1, early visual area, and anterior VTC is where we expect the object recognition to pop out. And you can see as well this, this is the complicated conceptualization, because here we're looking at each layer of each neural network and comparing that to different brain areas. So you can see, say, like V1 early visual areas, it kind of peaks sometimes even in the middle of the networks, whereas the object recognition always peaks at those final fully connected layers. Yeah. All right. So if we look at all of these different comparisons that we've made using this RSA technique, so with CNNs versus models, the CNNs represent category independently from shape. This information peaks at the final fully connected layer, and that the depth or size of the networks does not increase peak category or shape correlations. I didn't speak much to the architectural differences, but there are also parallel processing versus serial processing in some of the networks, but it doesn't seem to affect the correlations. CNNs demonstrate this 2-way interaction between shape and category, which is similar to the visual ventral stream, which you saw with the ROIs. And the final layer of CNNs correlates highest with anterior VTC, V1 peaks at earlier layers. And this shows that CNNs reflect a similar order of computational stages as the human ventral pathway. Okay, now that's the end of my talk. I have all of these people that I've worked with who are current and previous, who've contributed on these papers. So I definitely want to give a shout out to them. And thank you for listening.
We have time for questions.
So what I'm wondering is, as someone who doesn't work with people in this stuff, the categories of funds and grants, are you maybe talking about or because like you said, with the small number of players without those, it still kind of shows that maybe kind of effect.
Yeah.
And so if you have more layers, we just prolong the kind of this representations further in the network.
That's kind of what it looks like. So I forgot to mention that all the networks are trained on ImageNet, so 1,000 different categories of objects. I think I can't remember if it's 1.2 million images or 1.5. It depends on which ImageNet data set you're looking at. So their main goal is to distinguish between objects. And it seems that the so this is, yeah, so this is showing the category and shape information. And so it only seems it could be that like that final readout going through the network, that information only becomes relevant at the final stages of processing. And there you want to have a maximally distant distinction between different categories. Yeah. But yeah, it's kind of, it was like really quite perplexing because we're wondering, what are these networks doing as you keep adding more and more layers? They don't seem to be doing very much. Like the ResNet 50, you've added in, it doesn't seem to do much. Really even have much better representations than AlexNet with only 8 layers. Yeah, and yeah, I guess it depends on how you might relate these to, say, the number of layers of processing you would have within the brain, or if there's recurrent processing. Is there a way that you could say that, oh well, this network is looking at it unfolded in time, and
It seems like if the brain can create a simple representation of the same level of processing, that would make sense, right? It's like coefficient.
So I tend to prefer the shorter, more shorter networks which have a much clearer map into our visual areas, because then how do you interpret layer 31 in ResNet 50? How would you even say that represent, where is that represented in the brain, or where could you even say there's a correlation? So yeah.
Okay, yeah, very fascinating work, Astrid. I'm curious, and this is a general question, but have you looked at alternative linguistic explanations of the data? I mean, given that the data sets is a labeled data set, so if we can, is there any evidence that we use labels in this information on the data task?
Well, I think that you could just even use, say, numbers in place of the labels, which is really what it's just doing, in the DNNs we're talking about. Like when they're trained for object recognition, they're saying this is category 3126. So,
but I mean, the units themselves, when they're doing the task,
yes,
the behavioral task, are they labeling the objects? Is it,
for this second study, they're grouping them based on, say, category, and so there's some level of say semantic information even in, say, the way that the data set is selected. So for example, in this data set, we had it quite controlled that they're small furry mammals versus creepy crawly objects, and avoided animals that could be, say, pets or had limbs, like, so that it's quite controlled to minimize the level of other semantic information that could be present and influencing how humans would categorize these objects. But yeah, there are people who've done, looked at, I mentioned this animacy spectrum, and people have as well, like, looked at, if you would eat this animal, does that influence your perception of it? And there's been like one study looking at edible animals versus non-edible animals, or like if it could be a pet or not a pet. So I think there are people who work in that space of like looking at how semantic information can influence how objects are grouped together, which would then imply that language and linguistics also has some influence around that. I tried to distance myself from that, or try to, I guess, better control and that those sort of linguistic effects. But,
So the first commission is basically it's going on the Wilhelm's hierarchy, which is
that's true.
kind of linguistically organized and taxonomic. So the question is it really like a perceptual organization, or is it a linguistic organization?
There have also been efforts to create image databases that you can train deep neural networks on that are more reflective of our visual environment and diet, that like objects in capital letters, objects database, because I think with ImageNet, for example, there are 40 or 50 different species of dogs, and how much people have also tested how do humans perform with ImageNet? Can they distinguish between all these different species of dogs, for example, and what's the human limit of this? But yeah, you're right that database was constructed on scouring the web and the associations between words, but then you could also argue there are some categories like guns that aren't relevant in Australian context, and not so much. So
It's saying that. So does that mean that this is like a barrier to the problem, in the sense that even if we have a new data set which is so they don't have a particular name, they just kind of have a shape. That the networks would still classify this in the same way as certain public spots.
I'm sorry, I don't fully get the question.
So if you have if you create images from scratch of things that don't exist, that look like it, and then you do the same thing, would the network still have the same inherent problem? Label it in the style of, it looks mostly like it looks mostly like a camera or a microphone. Like, is that going to produce the same label that it was struggling before?
I mean, the networks are trained to I guess discriminate between objects and find whatever properties they can capitalize on to maximize the distance between any set of objects, say water bottle versus the plant. And so you might take color information, or you might take, okay, the location of the object, so this is on the ground, this could be on a table. And, you know, it will use whatever mechanism it can. So in the first study, we show how it is using scene information, just like us, to improve our image recognition scores. So it's not just looking at the bottle, but it's looking at, say, the table that's on, or where that is in space. So yeah, the question is like how can you also how do you also test objects that are removed from that context? So this second study, you can see there's no background. They're just on this, like, we've removed all contextual information and just asked it to classify the objects in isolation, which is very different to us in our behaviourally relevant context, where we're always in scenes, always, and so I guess that's what makes that first study super interesting, is how do you study the two together?
Thanks, Astrid. Nice talk. I was wondering about the way you've kind of varied the number of layers in these models. I've got so much with this type of model, but I'm aware that, like, people come up with the final layer and reframing it on function. The weights just in that last layer. But like, is it the standard practice is to kind of throw out like more than just the last layer, like vary the number of layers kind of quite significantly, because you'll have very different shapes or features represented within each of these layers. And kind of a related question, was there any fine tuning done, like given that you have made these like that kind of quite dramatic adjustment?
Yeah. So the 4 networks that we, I guess, traditionally studied had done well in that ImageNet competition, and they're architecturally a little bit different. So I'm just trying to find the diagram that shows the different networks. Say here, it's not the prettiest, sorry. But here you can see the top 2, AlexNet and VGG, have this serial architecture where you have convolutional layers and fully connected ones. GoogleNet has a strange architecture with multiple branches. And then ResNet is one of the architectures that you can really vary the number of layers. So you can have ResNet 101, ResNet at 1000, and you can really just ramp up the number of layers because it has this skip connections, they call it like residual networks, so that it, unless it has an improvement in the in what it's learned as you go through like this serial processing, it can also skip that information. So which allows you to create this shortcut and have this expansion of layers. So I think the standard practice is to remove the final layer when doing comparisons, because it's too task dependent. So usually then, the category information is super high because that's what it's being trained to do. So that's what you would expect. And normally what you would do is say you'd feed in the image, and then whatever the nodes of the network, whatever the values are, you can then build the matrix based on that. So with the early convolutional layers, it's pretty big, but then as soon as you get to the fully the final layers, it's it's much lower dimensional spaces.
I just going back to what I was asking. Do people like take resident and then like far out by the sliders? Is it really on they just far out the last layer?
They just throw out the last layer, and you can, but yeah,
But
and
that's what you
oh, I think I would have, yes, yeah, I should.
Just trying to
Well, this.
understand why there's different type of throughout the variant versus like you sort of this very flat structure, for example, for resident.
Oh, right, yes, yeah. This one, yeah, yeah. So the question is, what is it learning? And because it has this skip connection, it maybe isn't really. It doesn't matter how many extra layers of processing you have. It's not actually improving the classification, or it's not even learning that much additional shape information. And strangely enough, it's even going down at like in the dataset A. So yeah, you can. There are people who can take ResNet 100, ResNet 150, and I think maybe I even have results from that where we did. Yeah, so this is like, yeah, this is a bit gross. Sorry. So the ResNet. So orange is shape information, category is blue, and so this is ResNet 50, ResNet 100, ResNet 150, and what you know which one is which just because that's where the line terminates. So here shape information and category information are going up. For ResNet 50, here there's a dip in the shape, and so category goes up, and yeah, so as you increase the depth of the network, yeah, it doesn't seem to be adding very much in terms of the representation of rich content or shape of category. Credit us. Oh yes, sorry, you can't quite see, but that column is A and that one's B. And so the top is, well, we actually just want, this is the behavioral model correlation down the bottom. So you only really want to see the bottom two graphs here. Yeah. Okay.
Questions about later data? Thank you for stating that. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you, Astrid. That's really interesting.